James Sambon, whose name this lecture is given, was an outstanding ophthalmologist in Lexington, Kentucky for many years. After completing his undergraduate medical degree at the University of Louisville, he trained in ophthalmology at the University of Cincinnati. Among the honors he received was election to Alpha Omega Alpha. His surgical skills were enhanced by his service in the Korean War, an experience he valued in developing his sense of compassion and his willingness to make an extra effort in ministering to his patients. Throughout his career, Dr. Sambon always was eager to apply new and innovative technology to his practice, while never losing sight of the physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of his patients. He enjoyed teaching and served as the voluntary faculty at the University of Kentucky. During the later years of his professional life, which was extended by a heart transplant, Dr. Sambon became increasingly concerned about the variety of ethical issues, rapidly occurring changes in medicine, and the impact of societal changes on the medical profession and the welfare of individuals needing care. The Sambon family ensures that the ethical issues of importance to Dr. Sambon are addressed through their endowment of this lecture series. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Peter Singer today.
Thanks. It's really great to be here, and I've very much enjoyed over the past 12 or 16 hours hearing about the terrific things that are happening here in bioethics. It sounds very exciting, and I wish all of you who are involved in that here good luck. I'm a retired Bioethics Center director, so today, though, I'm not going to go into those bread and butter issues of bioethics. Rather, I'm going to talk about some work that my colleagues and I have moved to, which includes some ethics, includes some policy, includes some science, and maybe takes a broader sweep, but is very much focused on science in the developing world. It's the work we're primarily focused on, and I hope that it will have some broad interest. Really, this is my core message, and this talk is also about globalization. The core message is that the globalization of life sciences can lead to a fairer, healthier, wealthier, safer, and smaller world. That's my message, and that's the message I'd like to go through in about 30 minutes or 40 minutes of slides, and then leave time for discussion. Normally I start with healthier, but today, in honor of the ethics nature of the talk, we'll start with fairer. So, you know, the world isn't a particularly fair place. I spent my life doing things like developing living wills, and I've known of Dr. Duca's work for many years when I was developing a sort of preference-based directive, and he was developing a values-based directive. About 10 years ago, I started to realize that, and this also was in the context of our Bioethics Center, that some of the really most fundamental ethical challenges were the global challenges. I mean, just one little snapshot of that is shown on this slide, which is that the life expectancy in North America is 80 years and rising. Whereas in many parts of the developing world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, especially as a result of HIV and AIDS, it's 40 years and falling. And if that isn't the mother of all ethical challenges, I don't know what is. If you just think about, for those of you who have children, I have a 17-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old daughter. Their worries are how they're going to get driven to their singing lessons and their skating. If by the luck of the draw they were born outside of Kampala, Uganda, they'd be concerned about a totally different spate of things. And if that isn't a very, very fundamental ethical challenge, I don't know what is. I got interested in thinking about how to approach this challenge when I met these kids. These kids are in a small village outside of Pondicherry, India, on the east coast of India, and this is a village involved with a project of the M.S. Swaminathan Foundation, Swaminathan being one of the giants of Asian science and the father of the Green Revolution. And you walk into this village, and it's all hooked up to the internet. So you would walk in, there's an information kiosk in the middle of the village, despite the dirt floors and the thatched huts and the barefooted kids. And you hear stories like the local fishermen who don't go out in a storm and therefore don't die because they're checking the U.S. Navy weather satellite, or the farmers who check the grain prices on the local market so don't get ripped off, or the local youth who find employment opportunities as firemen 100 miles away that they otherwise wouldn't have. Or at the time of the tsunami, and I know you've had another one of these lectures on the tsunami, that whole telecommunications infrastructure actually let these villagers be warned, so they were able to escape the tsunami. Lots of damage of property in these villages, but not much loss of life. And that got me thinking about the role of science and technology in development as a real concrete example. And my colleagues and I began to start to think about, okay, well, if those are the sorts of issues around information and communication technology, what about the life sciences? What about genomics and biotechnology? And what's the role of that whole medical research enterprise, much of which is founded on those sorts of issues? I noticed the Flexner Way on the way here, much of which is founded on those sorts of issues. What's the role of our life science enterprise in tackling those problems and in strengthening those situations? Well, around the same time, the UN Millennium Task Force on Science, Technology, and Innovation, and here's a picture of their report, which was issued a couple of years ago, reached a very similar conclusion. As many of you probably know, there's this thing called the Millennium Development Goals that are supposed to guide UN agencies on their development objectives. A lot of that is framed around issues like malaria, like HIV, like tuberculosis. But this task force looked at the role of innovation on science and technology in meeting the goals and came to the conclusion that the Millennium Development Goals could not be achieved without a focused policy on science, technology, and innovation. I won't spend much time talking about ethical theory in this talk. But in fact, these questions of fairness, these discrepancies in life expectancy, underlying which are discrepancies in knowledge, which, if addressed, could lead to development, have a very strong ethical flavor as well. The most obvious element of that would be the inequities in the world, the inequities in health, the inequities in knowledge. But I actually think there's something far more fundamental in play. Some colleagues and I did an exploration, looked at the various values that could underlie global health ethics. We published a longer version in the journal International Affairs that you see, the site down there on the left, and a shorter version in PLOS Medicine. But essentially we walked through the various types of values that could underlie a global health ethic. Equity, human rights approaches, some of the early environmental approaches, and all sorts of different types of values, and concluded that the primum inter pares, or the most fundamental of those values, was actually solidarity. Because if you don't have a sense of solidarity, if my 12-year-old daughter doesn't have a sense of solidarity with a 12-year-old child living outside Kampala, Uganda, all those other values will fundamentally be bereft of any meaning. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on the theory of that, but just to say in this first segment that the world is not a terribly fair place, that some of the greatest inequities, but by no means the only inequities, are between the industrialized and the developing world. Obviously, there's huge inequities within countries like the United States and Canada as well. That science and technology, or knowledge divides, are part of that problem. That science and technology innovation can be part of the solution, and the world can become a fairer place as a result. The globalization of life sciences could also lead to a healthier world. This is some of the very early work we did. This was using the method of David Letterman et al. You're familiar with that, the top 10 list. So we conducted a Delphi-based consensus study of about 36 life scientists, all of whom were from the developing world. This was early, around 2002, 2003, and asked them, what do you think are the top 10 biotechnologies most likely to improve health in the developing world? And you see the top 10 list on the right here. We published it as a paper in Nature Genetics, and this report we sent to health and science ministries around the world. We subsequently did the same thing with nanotechnology and actually with regenerative medicine. And what I want to do to illustrate this healthier world element of globalization is just to go through a couple of the examples. And the ones I will pick up specifically in that list is an example on vaccines and actually an example in bioremediation, just to give you a sense of what's going on. So this story is about Cuba and the meningitis B vaccine. And in the top left corner, you see the epidemic curve of meningitis B in Cuba, which broke for a number of reasons, but one of them was the introduction of a domestic Cuban meningitis B vaccine. This was actually one of the first meningitis B vaccines in the world, had been exported from Cuba, including into the United States, despite the embargo, in a type of joint venture with a multinational. And when you really think about it, a small, poor country like Cuba being able to tackle a domestic health problem like meningitis B based on its own domestic innovative capacity, it's actually quite an interesting storyline and a bit of an archetype for what might come. The top right picture is in the South Havana Technopole, the biotech center. And as some of you probably know, there's a long history of biotechnology in Cuba. Strong political leadership led to that. I'm not here to advocate for the political environment in Cuba, but just to say one of the features of the political environment is sustained leadership, and you can think beyond the next 4 years of an election. And you walk into it and you see these sort of products. Think about all the U.S. biotech companies you walk into and there are no products. So this is a good example of how life sciences can yield a healthier world in a developing country, a Cuban domestic outbreak of meningitis, and domestic innovation against it with the meningitis B vaccine. This is less of a happy story, but another case where life sciences could make a big difference. This is the story of mass arsenic poisoning in Bangladesh. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but there's about 50 million people poisoned with arsenic in Bangladesh. And when you track that back, it's actually a sad story of unintended effects of development. You'll remember the concert in Bangladesh and digging wells in terms of getting rid of diarrhea. Well, it turns out that when you dig those deep wells, there's arsenic that comes into the aquifer. There's different ways to approach this, but some of them are based on science and technology innovation. One can approach it through, at the moment, you're using regular filters and throwing the sludge back in the river and measuring. That's not very satisfactory. There are some opportunities with nanofilters, but this top right picture was an attempt on our part to bring together some scientists to tackle this problem through genomic sequencing. Turns out that in the microbial ecology of those wells, there is a group of organisms that metabolize arsenic. There are the bad guys, the oxidizers, which are the guys at the bottom of the well in Bangladesh, that take arsenic, oxidize it, put it in the aquifer. Meanwhile, at the bottom of a gold mine in Australia, there are the good guys, the reducers, in the same bacterial family that reduce the arsenic and take it out of the aquifer. So that's a perfect setup, actually, for genomic sequencing. Bacteria of the same family with different functions, what's the underlying science, and how can that be exploited, if you will, for the diagnosis of the wells and ultimately potentially for remediation of the wells. We brought together a group of scientists from Bangladesh, from the United States, from Canada, from Australia to tackle this problem. It actually doesn't cost much money to sequence all those bugs once you've already made the infrastructure investments in sequencing centers, as several countries have. And this is a project we could never quite get off the ground. USAID, the Department of Energy eventually picked it up. They're sequencing the bugs slowly. But it's a good example of actually a disconnect between the science systems of our countries and the foreign policy or development systems of our countries. Because if you had a 50 million person problem, you wouldn't be taking your time sequencing bugs. You'd try and prosecute that with some rigor. So here's another example of life sciences, in this case genomics, potentially influencing a huge humanitarian problem, and actually the difficulties in the way we currently think about domestic innovation over here, foreign policy over there, as a way of proceeding. Here is another example. So I showed you our top 10 list before. It's one thing to get 35, 34 scientists and make a top 10 list. It's another thing to do something similar and then put $500 million behind it. That's what the Gates Foundation did and their Grand Challenges in Global Health program. This is the paper from Science in 2003 that announced the Grand Challenges. It is another example of life sciences and global health and how the globalization of life sciences can make for a healthier world. When you scan this, and I won't go through it in detail, you'll see that a number of the Grand Challenges defined as fundamental blocks between where we are and where we want to be in global health, fundamental roadblocks, have to do with things like vaccine delivery, heat stable, single dose vaccines, the creation of new vaccines, some stuff about controlling vector populations. So for instance, an anopheline mosquito wouldn't transmit malaria. Some stuff about nutritional enhancement of foods, and then various stuff about population health metrics and diagnostics. That malaria example is actually not a bad one just to rest on for a moment as a bit of a segue, because it does show a little bit about what one's up to here. So I'm going to list a number of different ways of tackling malaria and ask you which one you would vote for if you could only pick one. And I'll just list them up front. They are bed nets, bed nets, distribution of existing anti-malarial drugs, new drug discovery to get around the problem of malaria resistance, development of a malaria vaccine, and control of vector populations so they don't transmit the malaria parasite. So let's just see a show of hands. If you could only pick one of those options, which of those options would you pick? Who's voting for bed nets? Who's voting for distribution of drugs? Who's voting for new drug discovery to get around resistance? The vaccine? Control of vector populations? So it's a good example. Never let somebody come in and get you to vote for only one thing. Because that's actually the way we think about it. But if you think about those choices, as you go from the top of the list to the bottom of the list, you are working on the near-term future versus the longer-term future. If all you did, for those of you who voted for bed nets, today was ship bed nets, 10 years from now you'd still be shipping bed nets. If you ship bed nets, and you must because there's a humanitarian crisis, but also at the same time developed a vaccine or some of the vector genetics approaches, you have a chance of getting more to the root of the problem. So one needs a balanced portfolio. And I think I've just taken a little bit of a segue on this Grand Challenges list to make that point. This guy is the Health Minister of Nigeria, Minister Lambo, who made a very interesting point at this meeting in London about 2 years ago. He said, health biotechnology is essential for the Nigerian health system. When you just think of that, you could go to a lot of countries in the industrialized world and not have their health ministers say something like this. So this brings up issues of leapfrogging. It brings up issues of real commitment in the South to move forward on this. And he's holding up some of our things about the top 10 list on the left, how to do it, and something I'm about to show you on the right, how to do it. Sort of what to do, how to do it. I now, having talked a little bit about the globalization of life sciences and how the world is not a terribly fair place, and how potentially it could make it fair, but the fundamental value is solidarity. Having given some specific examples of applications of the life sciences to health issues in developing countries, I want to talk a little bit about now how the life sciences could make the world a wealthier place. And what I mean by that is domestic innovation in the developing world, featuring the small and medium enterprise sector, to tackle some domestic problems. So the Cuba one would be a great example of what I'm talking about. That example actually is a highly entrepreneurial example, but not a capitalist example. What I'm now going to talk about is some examples of small and medium enterprise and science-based industries tackling these domestic problems. We started looking at this by doing case studies of 7 emerging economies, countries like China, India, South Africa, Brazil, We did case studies of these countries, of the health biotechnology sector in these countries, and we wanted to understand what it was that led to domestic health biotechnology innovation. These were published in this supplement to Nature Biotechnology in 2004, but the lessons are shown on the right side of the slide. Essentially, when you look across these case studies, the sort of things that lead to health biotechnology innovation in this case, the emerging economies, were strong and sustained political will, and I've already joked about Castro in relation to that, but it's true in the sense that, you know, for many years he would go down to the garage where these guys are working and say, anything you guys need today? And you don't have to be in Cuba. I mean, just as an aside, I was at the Indian Science Congress about a year and a half ago, and the president of India was there. So he's not the head of state, who's the prime minister, but the president was there holding this lecture at the Indian Science Congress with thousands of people, lots of school children in the front, because he's very interested in educating children. The lecture was about science in India. He had, like, 150,000 PowerPoint slides, densely packed with text. And the one I really liked was how he was extolling the virtues of stem cell research at this place in India. So I just had a flash there about, would you see George Bush, for instance, standing up with 150 PowerPoint slides extolling the... now, whatever you think about stem cell research, the point I'm making is real engagement of political leadership in science. And you know how people say he's not a rocket scientist? Well, this guy actually was a rocket scientist and was involved in India's missile program before. So anyway, individual leadership on the part of entrepreneurs, close linkages and active knowledge flow. If you think about how fragmented the science part and the business part is in many places, and the need to bring together incubators, this is exactly what's happening. For instance, that Cuba example, lots of talk back with the manufacturing and the science, focused efforts in niche areas, IP, and private sector development, which is where I want to focus now. So just a word here about aid and sustainability. So the standard approach to foreign aid used to be take $100 billion, dump it into a developing country, hope for the best. That's not the most sustainable approach to aid. I mean, I actually want to argue that the difference between a developing country and an industrialized country, the number of differences in governance and so on, but one of the key differences I would argue is innovation. Industrialized countries take problems, they innovate around them, they produce products, and they commercialize them. Far more so than developing countries, particularly in science-based industries. This increasingly had been recognized. So after this sort of public approach to development, public funding approach to development, there was something called the Global Compact at the United Nations that enlisted the role of multinational corporations in development. And then people started to focus on the domestic private sector in the developing countries, the small and medium enterprise sector. And that's what these two things show, the UN report Unleashing Entrepreneurship and this book, Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, that talks about the domestic private sector in the developing world and emerging economies. That's what we studied in the area of health biotechnology. So last week, for instance, we released this paper in Nature Biotechnology on Indian biotech, which is the most detailed study of, at the company level. The previous thing I showed you with the psychedelic cover was in the country level case studies. These case studies are at the company level. So we looked at 21 companies in India, health biotech companies, and how they were innovating against their own domestic health needs. And I'll just tell you a couple of the stories which shows you again some of the power of this sector. So this picture is Shanta Biotechnics. And one of the, in Hyderabad, one of the, I think, most tragic stories in global health, highly unethical, is how it took about 20 years or 25 years from the discovery of hepatitis B vaccine to get that vaccine to people who needed it. There's a 25-year lag there. And as you know, hepatitis B is a major cause of liver cancer. It's particularly a problem in Africa and in Asia. According to the CDC, the prevalence rates of the surface antigen, which shows the chronic condition, can be as high as 8% in some of those regions. I mean, it's a significant global health problem. The vaccine was discovered, it wasn't being delivered. What this company did in the late 1990s was a process innovation in the manufacturing of the vaccine. The vaccine previously had been made in a particular type of yeast. They started making it in another type of yeast, which made the purification of the vaccine much easier, which dropped the cost. And so the cost of hepatitis B vaccine in India dropped from about $20 or $15 US to about 50 cents as a result of this process innovation and when other companies got involved. And Shanta is now one of the major suppliers of hepatitis B vaccine, supplies 40% of the hepatitis B vaccine to UNICEF. So there's a good example of a company in emerging economy tackling a local health need through process innovation. The whole story here is actually about innovation and global health. On the top right, you see Biocon, which is probably the largest or the second largest biotech company in India. And this company started with anti-lipid agents, but then moved into domestic supply of insulin. I think there's about 30 million diabetics at the moment in India. And then moved actually into product innovation. It bought a U.S. company in North Carolina, I think, called Nobex, which was figuring out ways to deliver insulin through aerosol and orally. So that's a story. It's very counterintuitive. Indian multinational essentially buying a U.S. company, but it's a story of product innovation. The story at the bottom right is a company called Indian Immunologicals. This is was an animal vaccine company. They developed a rabies vaccine. The problem with rabies vaccine in India, and there's a lot of rabies actually in villages in India. You hear about it sort of in Bangkok, but it's an issue in Indian rural settings because of dog bites and other things. The problem is obviously the delivery of that vaccine with the cold chain. And Indian Immunologicals found, I essentially think about it as the McDonald's of rabies vaccine in India, because through a franchising mechanism, through a business innovation, they found a way to develop, to deliver using a cold chain this vaccine to 1,500 villages, and they're aiming for 4,000 and turn it into total immunization centers. So this is an example of how the globalization in life sciences can create a wealthier world, but through the small and medium enterprise sector domestically can also achieve significant health benefits. These are some of the Chinese companies that we haven't yet written up, but will be. I may just take a minute or two, because some of these stories are really remarkable. For instance, at the bottom right, SciBiono is a gene therapy company, gene therapy in China. The one at the bottom left is a sort of stem cell company. Top left is an outsourcing company for R&D, and top right is a company that has an oncolytic virus for head and neck cancer that it's developing. So I want to just give you a hint that there's a lot of innovation in some of these Chinese companies, some of which tackling domestic problems, huge domestic population, some of which will obviously be for export. Just as a type of footnote, I haven't talked much about multinational companies except for that Indian multinational Biocon. There obviously is a role for multinationals to play. To bring some of the ethics stuff back in, we did study large and small bioscience companies in US, Canada, and Europe to see how they were tackling some of these global challenges, often through various types of ethics programs or drug donation programs. I want to argue that this is a piece of the puzzle. People always focus on it, but the real answer is in the small and medium enterprise in the developing world itself. And what we started to do now is work with countries in Africa, outside of sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt, that already have pretty good biotech industries, looking at the tackling of local health problems. So for instance, we were in one African country at the invitation of the health minister, thinking about how the science and business could interact, tackling local problems like malaria, which accounted for 40% of clinic visits in this country, through, for instance, new diagnostics for malaria. So just a footnote that a lot of these lessons from the emerging economies are applicable to the lesser developed, so-called lesser developed countries as well. The second last area I want to talk about is the safer world, and that's a bit of the story of the dark side of the globalization of biosciences. This, I think, was really first brought to the fore by this report from the U.S. National Academies of Sciences in January of '06, which really for the first time talked about globalization of life sciences and the potential biosecurity threats that were associated with that and how they might be mitigated. It involves conceptual issues, and again, I'm just going to glance on them, but we can have time to maybe flesh them out later. Conceptual issues like human security, which is an evolved notion, an evolved political notion of security. It involves issues in global governance, and I won't dwell on those, just the theoretical background. We did start to look at how the bright side of biotechnology, which I've been talking about for the whole talk, and the dark side could interact in this report called DNA for Peace, which we released last February. And I won't go into it in detail, but obviously it's got shadows of Atoms for Peace. And the main point I want to make is how disanalogous the nuclear case and the biological case are, with the focus in the biological case on non-state actors, because it's so decentralized and everyone could do biotechnology in their garage, which is why the approach to state issues, which we find in the Biological Weapons Convention, is not going to do the trick as life sciences becomes globalized. So that was a lot packed into one sentence. But just to focus this, this I think is a good way to focus what I'm talking about. As a result, in part of that report, and then through subsequent discussions, just before he left his position as Secretary General, Kofi Annan delivered this talk at St. Gallen, talking about a possible biotechnology initiative at the United Nations, which would focus in greater depth on two main questions. First, how to expand the benefits of biotechnology and life science research to build better lives for people around the world, and I spent a lot of my talk talking about how that might occur. But second, how to develop a global framework to mitigate potential risks, how to reach workable consensus on appropriate measures, and so on. So this part, Safer World, is really just a nod to the idea that there is a dark side to what I'm talking about, both in the industrialized and the developing world, that concerns about biosecurity aren't limited to the United States, and that we need some innovative thinking in terms of how to mitigate those risks and in fact, turn them into benefits. So how do we ensure that at a minimum, the globalization of biosciences doesn't undermine human security, and at a maximum, and there's obviously risks associated with this, by linking them to security issues, actually fueling some of the development issues. If you go and talk about life sciences and development in some embassy, say in Frankfurt, you'll have 10 people at your talk. If you go and talk about life sciences and security, you'll have 200 people at your talk. And it just gives you a sense of how what's known as securitizing these issues fuels them. And there's obviously a great risk to doing that. But in this case, they do represent security threats as well as development opportunities. The last area I want to talk about is how life sciences can actually turn the world into a smaller world. And there's three ways I could tackle this. And I'm just going to highlight the three ways, but then zero in on one. One way is obviously the flow of labor. So on the left side is this paper we had in Science about 18 months ago or a year ago on scientific diasporas, interviewing scientists and entrepreneurs in biotech clusters in Canada who were born outside of Canada. It's one of our great competitive advantages in Canada, about their experiences with and desire to give back their knowledge to their countries of origin and how to facilitate that. So that's obviously a smaller world story. The whole human genomic variation, pharmacogenomics in the developing world, population-based pharmacogenomics, and nutrigenomics for that matter, is also a way to tackle this smaller world story. I want to actually focus in on something we're up to in terms of a global place for social action on problems like malaria, water, and climate change. And I want to just end on this. So we are in the process, as you may know, how many of you are on Facebook? Just raise your hands if you're on Facebook. So there's a sort of an age breakdown of who's on Facebook, eh? But in any event, as you may know, there's social networking sites like Facebook and MySpace for the, essentially, you know, I don't know how you'd all describe yourself. For social purposes and making friends, although it turns out that maybe some of those friends aren't real friends. But in any event, for sort of fun purposes, you've got Facebook and MySpace. For corporate purposes, you've got social networking sites too, called Jobster, LinkedIn. What's missing in the middle is social networking for social action. And we've started to develop, just on the small world story, a portal that we call Engage that looks at water challenges, climate challenges, health challenges like malaria. And the Water Engage one is up in a beta version, developing a global community. But just to give you a sense, if you'd click on this and what you would see. So we actually already have, you go to the awareness phase, there is a cell phone video of someone in a village with arsenic poisoning in Bangladesh that through a $200 challenge project was awarded to a civil society in Bangladesh by our group, a civil society organization. They went out and looked for awareness, took a picture, took videos of a guy with arsenic rash. Now, some of you are probably in medical school or in medical training or house officers. I went through medical school, I went through residency without actually even hearing about arsenic poisoning, 50 million person problem, let alone being aware of somebody who had it. And this is an example of how the internet can make, and the globalization of life sciences can make the world a smaller place. On the solidarity one, I'm just going to be very concrete about the sort of ideas that are up there. There's a video conference between a school in California and a school in Dhaka, where kids are starting to do joint science projects on arsenic contamination, on water contamination, getting back to that theoretical issue of developing a sense of solidarity in the kids. And on the technology one, it's not up there yet, but the vision is sort of an eBay for developing world technologists. So I've met many scientists and researchers in the developing world in the South. They're very well trained, they have great ideas, and they don't have access to capital in terms of research funds. So, for instance, before Zimbabwe really went down, I remember having dinner with the head of the Zimbabwean Medical Research Council, and I asked him what his annual budget was. And his annual budget was actually smaller than the budget of one of my grants. There's a real lack of access to capital in terms of Southern innovation. So the idea here is to put almost YouTube videos of Southern technologists, for instance, here addressing the water problem in Bangladesh, from Bangladesh, on a site, get them ranked either by users or through a scientific panel, sort of a click, donate now way of disintermediating all the things that lead to lack of capital flow to finance good ideas against global problems. So just an example of how the world is becoming smaller, and whether that's in water or malaria or climate change, how the world's becoming a smaller place. So in summary, I've argued that the globalization of life sciences can lead to a fairer, healthier, wealthier, safer, and smaller world. I've actually implicitly argued that with the wrong choices, it could lead to an unfair, unhealthier, poorer, less safe, and larger world. But that's not my message I'm emphasizing here. I've gone through these examples. I've tried to highlight that this really is one of the fundamental ethical challenges in the world. So while you're thinking of local ethics teaching, these global issues also ought to be in your consideration. Some of you might work in life sciences laboratories, have done, are doing, will do. While you're doing that, think about maybe how 5% of your effort can be expended to some of these larger problems in the world. The wealthier, safer, smaller world examples, I've gone through the domestic companies in the emerging economies and growing that innovation in developing countries as a way of sustainably tackling health problems. That's the learning to fish as opposed to getting a fish version of aid through innovation. The security issues that are only now becoming apparent from the standpoint of the developing world, people are only now starting to think about how to approach them. And of course, the smaller world issues, which refers not to that little exhibit in Disneyland, but rather some of the issues in genomic variation, the diaspora, and these examples of the global watering hole or global water cooler to solve water problems that I gave you. So I want to thank you for your attention. There's members of our team, some of our funders, and I think we now have probably 15 minutes or so for discussion. And I'm glad to take questions or comments on any range of things, these global issues, which I've been working on over the past few years, or anything you want to ask about a superannuated, defunct Bioethics Center director who's also been through a lot of the bread and butter issues in bioethics. Thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you much. As moderator, I want to go ahead and ask you to do one thing. When someone has a question, could you repeat it for the microphone so that in the web streaming they'll be able to hear it?
Sure.
Questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I particularly like your focus on social action. I'm assuming that you're familiar with Paul Farmer's work, and I just finished teaching one of his books last night, in fact. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to the ways that your work might complement his or might be in tension with his. One of the things that he emphasizes is that in order for us to address these major health issues, we need to listen to the voice of the poor. And I'm wondering if that's possible in your picture. Also, he argues against development in the sense that he gives the example of Haiti, which you probably know, where they brought in a dam and that left the peasants landless, and they had to go up to the hills and created tremendous health issues. And so, it seems to me that for all of the vision here about global directions, that he would say something like, we need to be thinking about the impact on the poor as we're developing and so on. So
yeah, it's a very nice question. I won't repeat it all, but the question was a comparison between the ideas we've been discussing and the work and ideas of Paul Farmer. And so just a couple of quick comments. One is, one similarity is a real attempt to find resonance between theoretical ideas and practical steps. And so in Paul Farmer's case, it's liberation theology and clinics around tuberculosis, around HIV, and health services, shall we say. And in our case, it's the ideas in the background, the governance ideas, the human security, the solidarity, and innovation, especially in the small and medium enterprise sector, and the whole innovation system in the developing world. So one similarity is the attempt to find a linkage between the theoretical and the practical. One difference is between where in the future one is aiming. And that takes us back to the malaria example I gave you. Paul Farmer is tackling the urgent humanitarian crises in terms of lack of access to medical care through his clinics. And as I mentioned in the malaria example, that is actually the sine qua non. But when you're shipping bed nets, or in his case, setting up and servicing clinics, if that's all you do, you're only constructing the near-term future. There's serious issues in the future about sustainability and getting to the roots of certain health problems. So I would situate the ideas that I'm talking about as aiming 10 years further in the future. That's neither good nor bad. One needs to construct the near-term future, and one needs to construct the distant future. And so in that sense, you might consider the approaches complementary. There's a third similarity, which is a lot of his work, as you point out, involves engaging communities through listening to the voice of the poor. In our Gates Foundation grant that works on ethical, social, cultural issues along with the Grand Challenge investigators, we're actually doing case studies of community engagement to try and understand how to engage communities effectively as a practical matter. And moreover, on the voices of the poor, Southern voices, that's a strong emphasis in our Gates grant of what we're doing, because the very strong theme here of domestic innovation in the South. This isn't about developing a TB vaccine in Boston and shipping it over. The end game here is sustainable innovation in the South. So I guess there's some similarities, and really the only primary difference is a focus on the near-term or far-term future. And, you know, the hegemony or the ideological dominance of either of those approaches, I think, would not be in the interests of 4 or 5 billion people in the developing world.
Bob.
I'd like to ask you about money. I'm from Minnesota, and I'm particularly appreciative that my aging relatives can get bus trips from St. Paul, Minneapolis to Canada and achieve equity. I spent last May in South Africa, and in every law school I visited, one of the first doors you pass is a professor of AIDS in the law. And their success in combating AIDS in South Africa is through India. And the Indian companies that are finding creative ways about the patent laws and the other kinds of things. To what extent in your work do you find that you getting cooperation or opposition from, because certainly the pharmaceutical companies are global, Swiss,
yeah.
Dutch, whatever.
Yeah, but it's a very interesting question. So I'm totally with you. I mean, I don't know if you were in. Oh, the question is, I mean, there's different layers to that question. I'm going to start out with talking about the link between this and legal advocacy, which is where the question started in South Africa, and then the deeper question has to essentially do with the international patent regime and how that plays into global multinationals and the role of money in that whole system, and whether that's in favor of the ideas or opposed. I didn't talk much about patents. There was one little point. So that's not exactly the question, but it's the question I'm going to answer, and it's close enough because you're nodding. And so the first thing is to say that I think those South African advocacy efforts actually originally around apartheid, which is where those bona fides were really learned, I think, and then subsequently around the HIV crisis, are very important and high moral lessons for us all. So I remember interacting, you may know David McCoy Mason, who was the dean of the law school in University of KwaZulu-Natal, who I met 10 years ago, who was picketing apartheid on beaches. And actually one of the people on our team is the leader of Bioethics and Law Unit at University of KwaZulu-Natal. His name's Jerome Singh in Caprisa, which is one of the larger HIV research centers in South Africa. So just to say I'm totally with you in terms of that legal activism and the spirit of South Africa. In relationship to the specific question around HIV drugs, it's obvious that CIPLA and its chairman have made a huge contribution to access around a short-term humanitarian crisis. And some of the companies we studied, actually, there's an Indian company called Bioethics that shipped HIV diagnostics to South Africa. On the broader question of intellectual property rights, I think one has to be really careful not to get entrenched in an ideological position. So, for instance, the way a lot of those emerging economies grew was through a temporarily permissive situation on intellectual property rights where they could build capacity, and then subsequently joining TRIPS, acceding to the TRIPS provisions, and at this point really being capable of innovation and welcoming those provisions. So there's a lot of where things are in development, and I think in the end it boils down to the same issue of whether you're constructing the short-term future, the near-term future, what path of development you're following, how you're emphasizing the humanitarian crises versus the innovation. I'm not sure, for instance, to take an example, Sierra Leone is going to be the hotbed of biosciences innovation in the next 5 or 10 years, or Zimbabwe for that matter. It's got governance issues, it's got corruption issues, and TRIPS isn't the thing that should come next. But there is a point on the development pathway when emerging economies do welcome a fair playing field in terms of intellectual property protection, because those companies in India are going to want to be exporting drugs in the United States, and they're going to want to be beating the United States at the innovation game. So there comes a point at which global rules work, including for the poor or countries that have been poor, like South Korea, for instance. So South Korea 50 years ago or 40 years ago had the same GDP as Ghana. And there aren't many people in South Korea at the moment, and especially not in Samsung, who would be arguing against TRIPS. So I think it's a matter of timing. I think it's a matter of where you are in the innovation pathway. And obviously, what I haven't talked about is the provisions of TRIPS that do, in theory and sometimes in practice, like in Brazil, permit access in the case of humanitarian emergencies.
Other questions?
Yes. You feel like making a comment on whether or not your proposal here for globalization and entrepreneurialism is similar to what Gore and some of those people are talking about, green technologies.
So so it's interesting. First of all, some of this is a proposal, some of it is inevitable. So some of what I'm doing is, a lot of what I'm doing is describing. Some of what I'm doing is proposing. Just to put that caveat there. I would say that there are some similarities around technological solutions to global challenges, which involve leapfrogging, which involve innovation in the South. I mean, the main issue in climate change, and I'm not an expert in the area, but a main issue in climate change is going to be what happens with cars in China. And so to think about a problem like climate change separate from the developing world, separate from the potential role of technologies and emerging technologies, I think is a mistake. So in that sense, there are some similarities. People talk about technological leapfrogging. They point to the role of cell phones and the need for Africa not to invest in infrastructure and telecommunications. So in that sense, there's similarities. There's similarities with environmental technologies. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the area. I don't know how well the domestic innovation in the South on environmental technologies has been cataloged. I'm not sure what that looks like, and I'm not sure how easy it is for domestic governments and others to foster it. So there's a question mark in the answer, but some of the themes would overlap and are similar.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, Avery.
I was really happy to see you say solidarity is a really important basic value. I wonder if you could say something about how solidarity avoids, in theory and or in practice, being sort of collapsing into a kind of global sort of disaster voyeurism or tourism. I mean, the image of the science classes in California and Bangladesh kind of freaked me out a bit.
Yeah.
It's 50 million people. It's not your science project sort of thing, right? So.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And so the question is, how do you stop solidarity from devolving into voyeurism? And we tackled this question in a very concrete way. My colleague Jerome Singh, who I mentioned earlier, has done some work and published some articles, for instance, on humanitarian crises and the role of the media in humanitarian crises such as the tsunami. So there's a really concrete example of the dangers of what you're talking about. I think the best way to answer your question is just to acknowledge the risk, but then argue about the relationship between that and the status quo. The status quo is that my daughters are going to live to be 80, and a 12-year-old girl outside of Kampala is going to live to be 40. To me, that's a more motivating driver and a bigger force that argues we should tap in, and our analysis is that the lack of solidarity is at the core of those problems, or one of the things at the core of those problems. So I think that's a bigger problem than the potential risk you highlight, which is a potential risk, which does need to be mitigated, and which does need to be treated with respect. Let me give you one example of how we're thinking about it. So malaria, let's be very concrete. Malaria causes about 2 million deaths a year. Maybe 1 million kids, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa, kids under 5. That's a bit of a catastrophe. It is totally silent, maybe a little less so now, but on the part of medical students, on the part of, I mean, it's not a raging concern. It was actually no concern when I went through medical school, and is not a raging concern. I'd be interested to hear some of the medical students think. But it's not exactly the main thing on the curriculum. It's not exactly the main issue. We've been thinking on this Malaria Engage of setting up a malaria memorial, which is, obviously fashioned on something like the Vietnam Memorial, and memorializing malaria deaths of children, using the same sort of technology for local civil society organizations to interview in a respectful way, for instance, parents of children who've died of malaria, and put that up in video stream on a map, like a Google Earth type thing, where people can go and see these children memorialized. So that draws attention to the problem. You might link it to funding people who have solutions for malaria, either political action or donating bed nets or even some of the technological solutions. You try and do it with respect. But obviously there's a risk, particularly I thought about some of the advanced directive stuff, when you're broaching issues of deaths in different cultures of children. So there's a concrete scenario, and I would say that doing it respectfully, featuring Southern voices, and making those invisible deaths visible is still a worthwhile undertaking, even while mitigating, obviously, the potential risks of so doing. You could see all sorts of ways something like that could go wrong. On the other hand, 2 million deaths, 1 million of them children, most under 5, many in Africa, is already going wrong, and it's already silent. So that's a concrete example of the line that one would need to draw. And I've chosen to answer that question at a very concrete level rather than at a particularly theoretical level, and just to acknowledge the concern that you're raising. And it's a concern we've thought about, for instance, in these malaria memorial plans. But on the other hand, I'm more concerned about the terrific lack of solidarity and terrific inequities that currently exist, and maybe that's a good place to stop.